done. I mean, it's hard to say, find the words, find a colleague with such dexterity and encyclopedic grasp on one of the most outstanding centuries in Arab studies, to just come up with this book and show you how, as an alien, and he's far from being an alien, he's just being modest, he's able to play these figures together and to arrive at a theory and an obsession, which I don't think is Orientalist at all. I think it's a true obsession, as you can tell. People die for it. That makes sense, and it's much needed now, because we do need a theory that integrates all this together. So it's just a job well done, Dr. Key. Yeah, so thank you so much.
If anyone has any other questions,
if anyone has any other questions, please. No. Yes?
Okay, I guess I do have a question.
Go ahead.
What was kind of these, I can't remember all their names, but people of the 11th century, what was their main kind of mana of the soul, of just their own internal self, and what role they place in kind of the whole expense?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I talked about, I talked about this book before I'd written it at Georgetown, and Yaroslav Stetkevich was there. This really old, serious, poetry guy.
Yeah.
And he puts his hand up and he's like, "This is just, these people you're reading, they're just playing games with words. They have no idea about soul. They don't care about soul.
He does that.
And he's right, and it's you're right. And there are these four people, I deliberately picked them because they all obsess in the same kind of way. And there's another stream in the 11th century and before of thinking about Ma'ana as a more kind of spiritual, soul-based thing that you can associate with Sufism and Islamic mysticism. And Raghib does that at times, and Ibn Sina does that at times. But in the end, I ran out of space, basically. And other people have worked on. I think the spiritual aspect of Ma'ana has been studied. But I should also
Al-Zahir wal-Batin, I think.
Yeah. Internal, external. In a sense, kind of building off what Mohammed was saying, it's easier. That concept of meaning and the soul, and of the external and the internal, makes sense to us in English. It really does. It makes sense with the European tradition. It makes sense with Christian mysticism if you grew up in Europe or America. It's kind of intelligible and easier to translate. And there are all these famous scholars of Islamic Sufism, in France and now in America, who do a good job of talking about it. In part because it's talk-aboutable. Because Islamic mysticism has a heritage in Christian mysticism, and what's interesting, I think, about this stuff is that it's not transferred. It's a different thing that it's much harder to get to grips with. It's kind of like a half excuse for not doing Sufism anymore. Maybe. And I should say on the Arabic question, I started in '97, college, first week, and I'm still struggling. That was a while ago. I took an OPI recently. Yeah, I got advanced mid. It's I'm not at native speaker level. I can do this stuff in the 11th century, but if we had a debate about modern politics, I'm kind of low on some of the vocab.
Everybody is low on modern politics.
So yeah, it's a process, but it's a lot of fun. Don't be discouraged.
Any other questions for Dr. Key? Oh, we have two more questions. Very good.
Just curiosity. Through all this study of Islam, were you ever tempted yourself to kind of convert?
It's not so much through the not so much through the study, because you're so in this like academic mindset. I mean, when I was living in Palestine, my friends tried quite hard to convert me at multiple occasions, and in the end, for me, it's it's the same reason that I'm not Christian. I'm just not sure. And I kind of admire people who are sure. Like these guys are all sure. No question about it. Don't know. I'm still hedging my bets on the question of religion. But yeah, I mean, it's part of the. You've got to be conscious of it when you're as part of the translation process. Like, and I talk about this a bit in the book. Like Ibn Forak in particular just doesn't make sense unless you get on board with his theological convictions. Like if you look at Ibn Forak with some kind of cynical God doesn't exist kind of reading, it all kind of falls apart. You have to kind of get on board and trust that he's rational in order to read the theory. So yeah, that's kind of part of the translation thing. So there were two.
Yes, you and then Ellen. Yeah, go ahead.
So I don't know how much you want to go into this, or how on topic it is, but I'm kind of curious about your time in Palestine and where you were and what happened while you were doing that, what you learned there.
I mean, it was kind of another world in the sense that it was unconnected to my academic work. I mean, I said on my grad school application that it made me better at Arabic. A little bit of a white lie. The Palestinian non-governmental industry, as it increasingly has become, is an English-centric industry in which Palestinian NGO professionals, when they want to talk about capacity building and World Bank projects, they use English, even if there's no English person in the room. No one says Bana Qudrat. It says Khalina Na'amal workshop for capacity building. But yeah, so I worked for 2 years in Nazareth with a small Palestinian human rights organization, and I worked for 2 years in just between Jerusalem and Ramallah with a large Palestinian funding organization doing like West Bank, Gaza, economic development, non-governmental capacity building stuff. 2002 to 2005.
Oh yeah.
I was wondering, this is more sort of a history question, but when did words and poetry lose their cultural importance? And was there a reason for that? Or?
I mean, I'm gonna
Sorry,
have a
question.
go, and then I'm turning this one over to Mohammed. But I would say, and there's a real risk here, and the risk is the risk. So Edward Said wrote Orientalism in 1979, the year of my birth, and it was the shock the field needed, because people didn't know that they'd been objectifying the Middle East and producing knowledge about it. People in Europe and America didn't really realize what had been happening until he wrote that book. That was a long time ago. I'm like 36, and it's still relevant. And the reason that comes to my mind because there's the real epistemological risk here of me saying, look, the Arabs, the Orient, obsessed with language, poetry, still a big deal, monolithic, other, unchanging, millennium, associated with, a whole series of Orientalist tropes, including poetry. And that's a real risk, and we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful about that. That said, I mean, if you try and look for an end point, if you identify this attitude to poetry in the 11th century and the 10th century and the 9th century and the 8th century, and the whole story is, the story that the tradition develops is, the Jews cared about magic, so God sent Moses with the burning bush. The Christians care about medicine, so God sends Jesus with the revivification of the dead. The Arabs care about language and eloquence, so God sends the Quran. To each people, a miracle particularly targeted to them. And that's something that develops in Islamic theology reasonably soon. And then you start looking for an end point to that. I mean, poetry is a big deal right through all the centuries that I know about. And then if you look at the situation of poetry in the Arabic world today, I mean, the two massive pop idol-esque TV shows are, I mean, there's a colloquial poet, there's a colloquial Gulf poetry, Sher Million, and there's a classical Arabic poetry, and the other Shu'ara. And these are getting big airtime. Like, it's not a joke to have a poetry pop idol. It's a serious thing that lots and lots of people watch, that people make lots and lots of money off. You look at Mahmoud Darwish's political status, it's not unconnected to his poetry. It is his poetry, and I think, you know, you'd be hard-pressed to find American poets who play the same kind of political role and have the same kind of political potential. American novelists, maybe. Like, that's, you know, the great American novel, like the stuff that you got made to read at high school, novels that tell you what America is. But poetry, not so much.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I can add any more to what Dr. Key has said, but it's a fundamental question, and it starts at the heart of you know, of Islam and the Quran as a revelation, you know, in the 7th century to Prophet Muhammad, where the society that the Prophet Muhammad lived in was a society of poets. I mean, the Arabs were known for poetry. There used to be a market or a fair where everybody comes together, like right now, your modern, you know, like a, you know, like your modern day sort of big party, where, you know, full stars, and everybody takes pride in reciting poetry. Not Mecca, by the way. Mecca did not have the best poets at the time. It was in Medina. So the Ash'ar al-Qura al-Medina at the time, so people from the Medina, from Yathrib, were great poets. So to have a text, a revelation that comes and defies that writing, that poetry that was so excellent. I mean, we're talking about beyond. I mean, it really is impressive ways of eloquence, and it is very hard to compose poetry in Arabic. There are 16 or 17, I think 16 rhyme schemes, rhythms, right? In order you can make scansions and stuff like that. It's not very easy at all to do. To come there and to defy this and says, what is it? Is this poetry? No. Is it prose? No. It's rhymed in a way, but it is not. ليس بالشعر وليس بالنثر. As Ibn Taha Hussein said, the Quran هو القرآن. It's actually, it became its own genre, right? In a way that when people was hearing the Quran being recited, it's like, oh no, this is not how you should say it. They tried to fix it because they thought that there was a broken line of poetry. So it wasn't hard. So when people tried to improve the inimitability, as Dr. Key was saying, how is a Quran, how a mu'jiza, an inimitable text, right? How did it come to be a mu'jiza? Because it does make poetry look very, you know, I mean, unpoetic in that way. It's further, it has a sublime diction. There are people who actually talked about this. Romani, Al-Baqillani, Al-Khattabi, most of those people came and said, okay, you want to know why Quran is great? Look at the poetry and let's see, you know, like how Quran beats everything. So they basically bashed poetry, except Al-Baqillani. It took terribly bad. Until Al-Jurjani comes and says, wait a minute, ما لا يتم الواجب إلا به فهو واجب, which basically means whatever you cannot finish the task with, whatever you need in order to understand the Quran, then it is important. And this is the Aristotle moment, if you study, you know, like if you read in the Latin Greek tradition, where he said to Plato, you know what, poetry is my medic, but it's good anyway, because it speaks about the universal truth of things. It is not that bad. And so Jurjani comes and brings poetry back. But before that, there was eras of people say, oh no, poetry is bad. In fact, the Quran speaks about poets. يعني وما هو بقول شاعر. This is not the weighing of a poet, you know. والشعراء يتبعهم الغاوون ألا ترى أنهم في كل واد يهيمون. All that stuff about how the poets are bad people because there was a connection between poetry and being like possessed or something like that. But that was different, right? So it's a huge question what you're saying, but people came back to write poetry. Poetry is important to express human experience, and it is important for us to understand how the Quran as an achievement in language is higher. But that takes, of course, generations of thinking and stuff like that. But yes, incredibly important question. And the language and the tonic and the phonic significance of the Quran is still affecting until today. But you have to understand Arabic to make the sound signify. But that's a different conversation altogether.
Yeah. As you can imagine, this is exactly the kind of discussion that people have. It's ahsan al-shi'r akzabuhu. Like the best poetry is the most untrue poetry. Yeah. But then the Quran is more eloquent than poetry, and so you have to unpick this stuff. The Barcellona thing that I didn't read was that, yeah, he kind of should be in, but I just, I don't rate him. Like, he just, he's not, Giorgiani is like Mami was saying, is the theoretical moment when good theory is written about this.
True story. Wow. That's good.
Thanks.
Well, Dr. Key, thank you again. Any other questions, leftovers, anything like that? Modifications, ideas, suggestions?
I just have one personal question. What do you find brings you? I know, how can you really relate all this years of study, or just when you studied metaphor, and how could you bring it back to your daily life? What kind of, how would you find kind of purpose in that, or what would bring light to your daily life through all this study?
I mean, I think, there are two things. There's as you could maybe tell when I was doing the biographical dictionaries, you can really geek out with the intricacies of this stuff, and it's fun. If you're the kind of person that likes that kind of abstruse detail, you can have fun with it. I think the more meaningful way is, and I'm teaching this undergrad course at the moment, Complet 101, what is comparative literature, what comparative literature is. It's the gateway to the major. And we're talking a lot about theory. Because I think what's interesting here is this theory is stuff that enables you to explain stuff. And we need it. Basically, we need it. We need theory to explain what's happening with politics, with gender, with with all this, with literature, with the stuff we read. We need to have theories that explain what it is that we're doing, and not that we then never just believe those theories and follow them, but then we develop new theories and then we argue about the theories. But this role that theory plays, kind of from the side of giving us words to explain what it is that's going on and making us think about what's going on, is kind of what was so good about these people on this language question, and is what we need when we try and be like students today.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Key. Thank you very much. Well, go change the world now.
Medieval Arabic theory.
Yes, of course.